Hello, my name is Jacqueline Pollauf, and today I'm going to show you how to change an entire set of harp strings. Most students, when they start out playing, just change strings when needed. So basically, if a string breaks, they go ahead and put a new string on. But as you get more serious about the harp, you might find yourself wanting to change the entire set of strings. Usually people do this because as strings age, they don't sound quite as good as new strings. Over time, the tone will get a little bit more dull with strings, and sometimes they'll also have trouble holding the pitch. So for myself as a professional harpist, I change all of my strings once a year, and then of course if they break in between, I replace those as needed, but I change the full set all at once a year. And I would say that serious students or amateurs maybe change their full set every 3 years or every 5 years. Some of it depends on personal preference or on how often you can afford it, because a full set of strings is pretty expensive. In this video, I'm just going to focus on the unique aspects of changing a full set of strings. So I'm assuming that you already know how to change a harp string and you know about the different materials that the strings are made out of. If you don't know any of that, I have a whole series of videos that covers it. So I'd suggest you watch those and make sure that you're good with all of your basics before watching this video. Now, when changing a full set of strings, of course, you need a few tools. You'll need a tuning key to unwind and wind the strings. You'll need something to clip off the excess length of strings. I like to use nail clippers for the little tiny strings. Some people also use scissors. And then you'll need wire cutters for clipping off the wire strings. A couple of optional things. You might want a pair of safety glasses when working with the wire strings, just to protect your eyes. And I also have a small pair of pliers. This can be really handy if you have a string that's stuck or you're having trouble getting it out from the tuning pin. Of course, you'll also need a full set of replacement strings. The harp that I'm going to use today is a Lyon & Healy Style 30. This is a 47 string pedal harp, so the largest possible size. You might have a smaller harp or a lever harp, and everything that I'll be doing here will apply to your harp. You'll just have a little bit easier time of it with less strings. I'm going to restring this the same way that it's currently strung. So I'll put nylon strings on this first octave, then gut strings from the second octave down through most of the fifth octave, and then wire strings for the bottom 12. There are a few things to keep in mind when it comes to purchasing strings. One is the age of the string before you put it on the harp. Basically, you don't want your strings to be really old, to have been sitting around for years and years. So I have a little cycle that I use with my strings to keep that from happening. I always have a full set of replacement strings on hand. That way, if anything breaks, I'm covered. And those are the strings that I'm going to put on the harp today. And then last week, I also purchased a new set of replacement strings. I will keep those on hand for this next year to be my emergency strings. And then when I change my strings again a year from now, I will put those strings on the harp and buy another new set. This way, I'm always using strings that are less than a year old. Another good thing to remember is that the first, second, and third octave strings come in really long lengths. So usually you can get 2 strings out of each package. So usually when I'm sitting down to order my full set of strings, I check to see if I have those really long lengths still in the packages, basically if they're completely unopened, because then you can use half the string for your replacement and save the other half for your emergency string. And then finally, most harp companies offer a 10% discount if you're purchasing full octaves of strings. So sometimes I might only need, say, 5 strings in this octave, but I'll go ahead and purchase all 7 so that I can get the discount. So just a few things to keep in mind, but of course you want to have your full set of strings ready to go when you're all set to restring your harp. When you're changing the strings, what you want to do is remove one string and replace it immediately. You don't want to remove a whole bunch of strings because that changes the tension on the harp. So it's always best to take one off, put the new one on, then move on to the next string, take it off, and put the new one on. You can go in any order that you like. Usually I just start at the top and work my way down. The really low wire strings can be a bit of a challenge, so I guess I like to save those for last. You also don't have to change the whole set on the same day. You could do just an octave or two one day, and then maybe do another couple octaves the next day, or maybe split it up between morning and afternoon. However you want to do it is fine. There's really no correct way as far as structuring all of that. And I think actually the biggest challenge with changing all of the strings is the tuning, because when you have a full set of new strings, everything is going out of tune all the time. So generally, as I'm changing, I'm tuning a lot to try and keep the harp as in tune as possible. Okay, so we're ready to get started. I'm going to start with this 0 octave G, the very top string here. Just unwind it to take it off, and then pull it out of the harp. Once the string is off, we can just go ahead and put the new one on. In addition to the low wire strings, these top nylon strings are probably my other least favorite kinds of strings to change, because they're so tiny. They can be a little bit hard to work with, tying the knots and everything. Oops. So once you have the string on, then the tuning begins. So I'm going to tune this string to the string an octave lower, and it's already starting to drop. But as I go, so now I'm on to the 0 octave F, the second string. Once I get this string on, I'll tune this one, and then I'll also tune the G. And then on the third string, I'll tune that one, and then the previous two. And I'll keep going like that. So every time I add a new string, I tune the new string, and then all of the previous strings too. It takes a little bit longer to do it that way, but I think it works out well, because then by the time you get all done, your strings have been tuned quite a bit, so your harp will still go out of tune, but just not as badly. Generally, the first couple days after I change all of the strings, I tune my harp a lot, maybe 3 or 4 times a day. And then I also try to practice a lot, even though it's really annoying to practice on a harp with all new strings, because that way the strings are getting played and you keep tuning as you're practicing, and the whole thing just starts to stay in tune a lot more quickly. Now we're on to the second octave of strings, and on this harp, this is where I'm going to change to gut strings. You can change to gut strings in a few different spots. This is pretty common, and this is how I like to do it, to just have the first 9 strings be nylon strings, and then gut from there until you get to the wires. Also, as I'm going, I'm saving the package of the strings, because like this one is so long, so this is one of the ones where you can use the excess for another string. So I'm just piling up my, my empty string packages, and then when it's time to trim all of the strings off, I can pop this excess right in the correct package. So here we are on to the third octave. There's nothing really special about the third octave of strings. Really, the only thing is that at this point we've changed enough strings that all of these ends are kind of getting in the way. So you can try and just sort of put them over the back of the harp so that they don't get down in the way as much. Some people also use a rubber band. You can rubber band them together, or you can try and rubber band them to the tuning pins on the back side of the harp. Something so they're not too annoying. Now we're ready to do the fourth octave of strings. When you make it to the fourth octave, you don't have to use the anchors anymore. A lot of people stop using the anchors around middle C. I'm going to go ahead and start right with this first fourth octave E string. So I'll just tie the knot, but not insert the anchor. Here we are at the fifth octave of the harp, and in the fifth octave, just 5 of the strings are gut. then it changes to wire on the 5th octave G. So we only have 5 gut strings left to do. These can get a little bit tricky because the gut is so thick that it's awfully stiff and sometimes a little bit hard to work with. One thing you can do when you're taking off the old strings is you can just snip off this curly part, the part that was wound around the tuning pin, to make it a little bit easier to pull these strings out through the base of the harp. And then when you're tying your knots for these strings, since the strings are so thick, sometimes you really have to pull to get the knot quite tight. When you put it on the string and start to wind it up, that will tighten it even more. But you want to get it tight enough that it will hold until you get to that step, and that can be a little bit of a challenge. So I'm really pulling the string with a lot of force there. And then at this moment, when you tug the string here, that tightens up the knot the rest of the way. So we are finished with all of the gut strings, and these last 3 strings that I took off, the 5th octave C, B, and A, I'm going to save these, and then later I'll just use my wire cutters and chop them up into string anchors. Now, for the wire strings, that's all we have left to do are these bottom 12 wire strings. And if you haven't changed a wire string before, it's important that you know that they're a little bit different than changing the nylon and the gut. When you thread the string up, you don't pull it taut and then begin turning. Instead, you have to leave some slack. And kind of like the gut strings, the thinner wire strings aren't too bad to work with, but when we get down here to these bottom ones that are really thick, they're just kind of a pain to deal with a little bit. 2 things to keep in mind. One is that you definitely want to clip off the end of the string before you remove the old string, the curly bit that's wound up around the tuning pin. And the other is that wire strings can scratch the harp, so you want to be careful not to damage the wood when taking off or putting on wire strings. And they can also cut you if you're not careful. The ends of them are very sharp. So just be careful in working with the wire strings. This is also where sometimes I start to use my little pliers. These strings really don't want to come straight again, so getting them out of the tuning pin can be challenging. So if you just grab the string just below the tuning pin with the pliers, that can kind of help to wiggle it out. So now all of the strings are changed, which is really exciting. And the only thing that's left to do is to trim off all of the excess strings. Some people like to leave the harp in this state for a day or 2, just to make sure that everything is fine before they trim off the strings. But I'm going to go ahead and cut them off now. And for these higher strings, if they're long enough to get a second string out of it, I'll just go ahead and put them right back in the original packaging. So here we have our completely restrung harp with an all-new set of strings. Just a couple of final thoughts. One is that sometimes people do a partial restringing. So rather than changing every single string on the harp, they'll change strings according to materials. So sometimes if the harp is sounding a bit dull, you could just change the wire strings. And a lot of times that would be enough to kind of brighten the sound up. Or sometimes people just change the gut and nylon strings. This can be a financial choice too. And one other small step that I did not do today, but a lot of people do when they're restringing, is that once they remove the old string, but before they put the new string on, they take the opportunity to clean the harp, because it's really difficult to dust all of these little discs with strings on. So most people just use a small clean paintbrush and kind of dust off in there when there's no string on the discs. So if you're going to go ahead and attempt to restring your harp, good luck. I hope it goes well.